we have 33 Catholic radio stations in 6 Western states, Immaculate Heart Radio stations in 6 Western states that reach it. And those 33 stations reach a total population of over 50 million people, including 96% of California. So that's a far cry from what I had originally planned. And it's a far cry from the way things were for me growing up in Pasadena a long time ago. My brothers and I were raised in the Presbyterian church, and I met my wife Janet in high school over 50 years ago. She was probably one of the first Catholics that I ever got to know well. And a few years after high school, we were married. I agreed to be married in Janet's Catholic church. I didn't have any anti-Catholic hang-ups. I saw us both as Christians, but her Catholicism was more important to her than my Presbyterianism was to me, so I went along with the idea of being married in the Catholic Church and raising our kids, future kids, in the Catholic Church, and I thought that was fine. I went along with it. My Southern Baptist grandmother didn't think that was such a great idea. She loved Janet, but she told us right at the minute that we announced the great news that we were going to be married, she said, it's just too bad you can't be married in a real church. So Grandma's first adventure into a Catholic church was on our wedding day in August of 1967. She was 91 years old, and it was 113 degrees that day in La Cañada, and she probably felt that she was walking into a very hot place. Janet and I were married before we finished college, so we were both working and finishing college, but after we finished college, we moved to Lake Tahoe, where we've lived for the last 44 years. We've raised our 4 children there, and now they've given us 11 grandchildren. But it took quite a while for me for the Catholic faith to sink in to my thick head. And I was very busy building homes, and I was involved with coaching our kids' sports. I coached their Little League and soccer teams and things like that. I left the religious things to Janet to take care of. And we would go to Mass every Sunday, but it wasn't sinking in. And it wasn't until God put me into a very strange situation, 25 or more years ago now, almost 30 years ago, where I was asked to help start an interdenominational Christian school in our small town. Our area was too small to qualify for a parish school, so we were going to try to start an interdenominational school, and I thought this is a great thing because I've always felt, I still feel today, that if Christians would ever unite behind something, we could really make a change, we could make a difference. So I went along with this idea. And these were friends of mine that were helping to start the school, and they asked me to be on the board with them. I didn't know it at the time. I wouldn't have understood the terminology, but in looking back, I was somewhat of the token Catholic who didn't know his faith, but I was the token Catholic on a fundamentalist school board. And what that meant was that at every board meeting, these good friends of mine, we'd be talking and planning the school. Something would be said about the Catholic faith, not in a mean-spirited way, but in an offhand way. This is what Catholics believe, or this is what the church teaches or something. And I knew enough to know that what they were saying wasn't right, but I didn't know enough to defend it or correct it. So I would go home, I would tell Janet, like any good husband, I would tell my wife what happened. She would either give me the answer or she would research it and find the answer through Catholic Answers and St. Joseph's communication, different places. She started building what turned out to be a very impressive library of Catholic books and literature. And with that information, then I would go back to the next board meeting and I would tell my good friends as politely as I could, you know what was said at the last meeting about what Catholics believe, that's really not what we believe, here's what we believe. And I would explain it to them. And I thought, this is great. I'm teaching these folks the Catholic faith. Well, none of them ever converted. I remember in particular, one of them asking me one time to explain the Eucharist, and I gave him the most pathetic explanation of the Eucharist. I'm still ashamed of it. But I finally realized after some time that the point of all this wasn't for me to teach them the Catholic faith. This was God's way of teaching me the Catholic faith. And then when it finally sunk in, when I started to grasp it and understand that Christ only started one church, and I was in it, that he was truly present in the Eucharist, those concepts hit me like a ton of bricks, and I don't think I've recovered since, and it's been more than 20 years. What I started to kind of have a vision or a perception was that the church is this gold mine full of nuggets that are just spilling out, and our job is to give those nuggets away as fast as we can to other people, and it just replenishes itself. Right about that time, Janet wanted our family to go to World Youth Day in 1993 to Denver to see Pope John Paul the Great. And that was a life-changing experience for me and for our family. And I heard Pope John Paul talking about a new evangelization where everyone needs to do something to bring Christ to the world. I didn't know what that meant for me. I was very introverted about my faith at that time. I knew I wasn't going to be a street corner preacher. I wasn't going to be able to knock on doors and tell people about Jesus. But a seed was planted. And soon after that time, I was going to be taking a road trip across country, driving one of our cars to our son who was in college back east, and he was going to be using our car for a while. And a good lady in our parish, who's still a good friend of ours, was very concerned about me being on the board of a fundamentalist school. And she gave me a grocery bag full of tapes to listen to keep me company on my drive across the country. All of Scott Hahn's tapes at that time and some other great tapes. So this is in early 1994. And I drove across country listening to those tapes, and I don't think I needed a cup of coffee from start to finish. And because it hit me that this is it. This is the truth, and it needs to be on the radio. And in between tapes, I would scan the radio dial just to see what I could hear, and I could pick up 4 or 5 or 6 Protestant radio stations anywhere in the country. But I never heard a Catholic radio station from coast to coast because there virtually weren't any. Soon after that, I found out that Mother Angelica had started a shortwave radio station with her programming that covered really virtually the whole world. And I got a shortwave radio. I hooked it up into our house with a 30-foot wire that ran down the stairway into the kitchen. And I even rigged up a way that we could listen to it in the car. I got a portable shortwave radio, wrapped the wire around our ski rack on the roofs. My kids were convinced, and might be right, that I was a little bit crazy about it, but it was life-changing. And the programming was fantastic, and I would be listening to it, but if any of you have listened to shortwave radio, it's like World War II quality. And we would get to the point of a program where the priest is saying just what I need to hear to change my life, and the static would fade in, and I'd never hear the point of the story, and my life wouldn't change. So in April of 95, my son and I took a trip to EWTN to meet with Mother Angelica, and we told her what we wanted to do. We wanted to start a Catholic radio station, an FM station in Lake Tahoe, where we lived. And we wanted to pick up her shortwave programming and put it on this FM station. And she thought that sounded great. She prayed over us, and she sent us up to meet with her radio engineers up on Radio Hill, several miles away from the monastery, several miles away from the TV station. And just like most of the employees at that time at EWTN, these were 2 good Baptist radio engineers. And we sat in a conference room. We told them what we wanted to do. We wanted to pick up the shortwave programming, put it on an FM station. And one of the engineers was very quiet, and the other one was not very quiet. And he said, you know what, you may as well go home. It can't be done. You don't have enough money. It can't be done. You can't pick up shortwave radio programming and put it on an FM station and expect it to sound any different than a shortwave radio. It's going to be staticky. It's garbage in, garbage out. You may as well go home. I told him what I thought about that, and we went home. And a couple of weeks later, the other engineer called me, and I wish I could imitate his southern accent, but he basically said, you know what, we figured out how to do what you want to do. Before we send our shortwave programming out on shortwave, We figured out a way to send it down to the TV station. At the TV station, we're already uplinking our TV programming to the satellite. There's a parallel band that's vacant. We can feed our radio programming onto that parallel band and set it up to satellite. It's going to cost us $10,000 for this piece of equipment. Mother said we can spend the $10,000, and she told us to call you and tell you that if you ever get that radio station started in Lake Tahoe, our programming will be up there on the satellite waiting for you. So we were the first group to sign an agreement with EWTN to rebroadcast their programming. And that's really what made everything possible for us, because starting a station was hard enough. Having to worry about programming would have made it impossible. But to be able to rebroadcast their programming really made it all possible. But after that first station went on the air, the stories started coming in, and that's really what made all the difference. As I mentioned to you, that first station was the 7th Catholic radio station in the whole country. Now there's over 400 Catholic radio stations. We helped to start the Catholic Radio Association, and they've played a part in helping all of those stations get started and spread across the country, and there's still more to come. In the last few years, we've put more of our effort into starting our own programming, trying to accomplish what Pope John Paul was talking about in the new evangelization, reaching our children and our grandchildren and our friends and relatives who were Catholic and are no longer going to Mass, trying to create programming that would attract them back while still engaging faithful Catholics and keeping them on board. So it's been quite a ride, but Patrick Madrid's show is a great example of that. Mother Miriam's show is a great example of that. All of our other programming is an example of what that attempt is, to try to engage people and draw them closer to Christ and His church.
Media is powerful. It can change a culture. It can change a whole generation. It can impact the entire globe. 2 years ago, Shalom World TV was a dream. Today, it's a reality. A commercial-free, high-definition television network broadcasting from the United States of America, reaching 375 million English-speaking people around the globe. We want to reach to the ends of the earth. Throughout the year, Shalom missionaries work day and night to accomplish this mission, to produce programs that evangelize the culture.
What is wrong with contraception?
Tonight on Seekers.
I can make time for you.
For divine knowledge.
We want to continue this mission. We want to produce more programs to impact this generation positively. Will you be with us? Can you take a commitment of donating just $25 a month for the next 12 months? We assure you of our prayers. Visit shalomworld.org/donate today. We thank you for your generosity.
I was in Rome and happened to be there right around Divine Mercy Sunday. And I knew that Pope Francis was opening the Year of Mercy. I had no idea how I could be involved in that, so I hadn't planned anything. So the Saturday before Divine Mercy Sunday comes around, and I'm hoping to be in St. Peter's Square during a prayer vigil that Pope Francis is going to lead to open up the Year of Mercy. Well, I had a priest friend who was there, a fellow confrere of mine in Oblate of St. Joseph, and he said to me, well, I have 2 tickets to get inside of St. Peter's, but the problem is you have to be wearing a cassock and a surplice to go in. The surplice is the white garment that you wear on top of a cassock. It's the formal liturgical wear that a priest or a bishop would use. Unfortunately, I had traveled to Rome without my cassock, without a surplice, had no even awareness that this might be a possibility, and I was too embarrassed to go. I said, I'm not going to be dressed right, it's not going to work, and as much as I would love to go to join you, I don't think that's the best thing. And he dragged me along. He said, do you know what? We're going to make this work. We're going to figure it out. We searched for a couple days to try and find a cassock for me to use. We didn't find one. We go there, And we go to St. Peter's to walk through the front doors, and there's a mass of people, a whole sea of people in the square. And I'm thinking, we're never going to get in time for this vigil. It's 15 minutes away. This is not going to work. And this priest friend of mine, Father Vincenzo, he's dressed in a cassock. I think it had red lace and red buttons just to look a little bit nicer, you know. He's carrying like a leather briefcase as we're walking through. He looks like he owns the place, right? He walks up to the Swiss guard, talks to them, convinces them that we should be let through. And we start going through these different obstacles and stages around the backside of St. Peter's. Until before I know it, we're inside of St. Peter's, seated at the priest section, when all of a sudden, I'm looking around realizing I still don't have a cassock, right? I still don't have a surplice. I'm wearing what you're looking at right now among priests, and everybody's dressed in their best. Everybody's ready for the arrival of Pope Francis. And I'm shrinking down into my seat, right? Thinking this is not supposed to be. I think the major thought in my mind was that parable of Jesus, right? About the man who comes to the wedding without a wedding garment, and he gets kicked out. There will be wailing and grinding of teeth, and this is what I'm imagining, right, in my head. And then the service starts. Pope Francis comes in. And all of a sudden I realized nobody cares about what I'm wearing. Nobody's looking at me. They're looking to the beginning of this blessed moment in the life of the church. Do you know what? I think we're gathered here together for very different reasons. Each one of us has unique circumstances, unique situations that has brought us to this point in our life and this moment in our faith journey. But there are two things that are common among all of us here. Two things that underlie everybody's story here. And the first is that God is love. That God created us out of love. That God desires us to be happy, to be fulfilled, to be with Him. I think most of us, we know this intuitively. God created us with this awareness in our mind and in our heart that He is love. I think the second truth, though, that is common to all of us is a much harder one sometimes for us to accept, and that is that we are lovable. You are lovable. That it's possible for God to care about you, to be concerned about you, to be present to you in the ordinary, everyday circumstances of your life. It's difficult for us to appreciate that because we're so focused on our sins. We're so aware of how we have grieved God. We feel like everybody is looking at us because we're not dressed appropriately maybe for the situation, because we haven't done what we were supposed to in preparing for that encounter with the Lord. We feel maybe like I felt there in St. Peter's, a little overwhelmed and a little unworthy to be there. And yet, we soon realize that it doesn't matter what other people are thinking about us. It doesn't matter what the rest of the people in our lives think about us. What matters is that God is love, that He loves us, and that we are lovable. And He's going to drag us kicking and screaming sometimes against all odds. He's going to bring us into His grace. And I think that's the amazing power of Immaculate Heart Radio, to spread that message, to share those two simple, undeniable facts, right? That God loves us and that we are lovable. And this is what we ourselves are called to share with others. So I truly hope that this day can be a reminder of that fact, of God's love for us, and that we can be instruments of that love in the world, that we can share the gospel message with all people, especially those around us, especially those most in need of hearing that message.